Paul Langston had always been a man of simplicity. He cherished the small things in life, a quiet evening with his wife, Helen, a home-cooked meal, and the occasional stroll through the park. But his life was anything but simple. Every day, he woke up to the sound of Helen's nagging voice, like an alarm clock set too early, too loud, and impossible to turn off. Helen was a woman who knew what she wanted, or rather, what she didn't want. She didn't want Paul. Helen had a best friend, Anna, who seemed to live the life Helen believed she deserved. Anna's husband, Greg, was everything Paul was not, or so Helen thought. Greg was charming, successful, and seemingly devoted to his wife. Anna never missed an opportunity to sing his praises. "Greg is just wonderful. He bought me the latest smartphone yesterday, and last week he surprised me with a trip to Paris." Anna's voice dripped with satisfaction, and every word stung Helen like 1,000 tiny needles. Paul, on the other hand, couldn't seem to do anything right. He wasn't charming in the way Greg was. He didn't buy Helen expensive gifts or whisk her away on exotic vacations. Instead, he worked long hours at his modest job, trying to make ends meet and save for their future. But Helen never saw his sacrifices. She only saw what he lacked. "Why can't you be more like Greg?" Helen would say, her voice tinged with disdain. "Anna's husband treats her like a queen. You don't even know how to make me happy." Paul would sigh and try his best to please her. He saved up for months to buy Helen the latest handbag she had been eyeing after seeing it with Anna. But when he presented it to her, her face twisted with disappointment. "This is last season's model, Paul. Can't you do anything right?" she snapped, throwing the bag on the couch as if it were a piece of trash. Paul's heart sank, but he swallowed his hurt. He loved Helen, even though she made it difficult, even though she never seemed to love him back in the way he needed. He had hoped that one day she would see his efforts and appreciate the life they had built together. But that day never came. The more Helen compared Paul to Greg, the more Paul withdrew into himself. He was a man of few words, but even those few words became scarce as Helen's nagging intensified. He became a shadow in his own home, walking on eggshells, trying to avoid the inevitable arguments. But no matter what he did, it was never enough. Helen's dissatisfaction grew, fueled by the constant comparisons to Anna's seemingly perfect life. She prayed for Anna's blessings, wishing she were married to someone like Greg instead of Paul. Every time Paul tried to do something nice for her, she found a way to criticize it, to make him feel small. It was as if she took pleasure in his discomfort, in his attempts to please her that always seemed to fall short. Then, one day, something snapped inside Paul. Helen had been particularly cruel that evening, belittling him over something trivial. Her words cut deeper than usual, and Paul felt an anger he had never known before rising within him. He clenched his fists, his knuckles turning white as he fought to control the rage bubbling up inside. For a moment, he imagined raising his hand against her, striking out in desperation and pain. But then, as quickly as the anger had come, it was replaced by fear. Fear of what he might do. Fear of becoming someone he despised. He couldn't believe how close he had come to hitting her, and the thought terrified him. Paul had always prided himself on being gentle, on never resorting to violence. But now he was scared of what Helen was turning him into, scared of the darkness that lurked just beneath the surface. He didn't say a word as he walked out of the house that night. He left behind everything: his home, his belongings, and the woman he had once thought he would spend his life with. He didn't know where he was going, only that he needed to get as far away from Helen as possible before he did something he would regret for the rest of his life. Helen didn't try to stop him. In fact, she seemed almost relieved to see him go. As the door closed behind him, she didn't feel the emptiness she had expected. Instead, she felt a strange sense of freedom. She was finally rid of the man who had never been able to meet her standards, the man who had never been good enough. In the days that followed, Helen told anyone who would listen that Paul had beaten her, that she had no choice but to let him go. It wasn't true, but it made her feel justified, made her feel like the victim instead of the perpetrator. Her friends, including Anna, patted her on the back and told her she had done the right thing. They praised her for standing up for herself, for refusing to settle for less than she deserved. Anna, as always, was full of advice. "You should leave him for good, Helen," she said one afternoon as they sat in a cafe. "You deserve so much better. Greg would never treat me the way Paul treated you." Helen found herself nodding along, liking the sound of Anna's words, liking the newfound freedom she had now that Paul was gone. She didn't miss him, not really. She told herself she was better off without him, that she could do better, but despite Anna's constant support, Helen couldn't help but notice something odd. Every time she asked to visit Anna at her home, Anna would make excuses. "Greg doesn't like visitors," she would say. "He's very private. We'll just meet somewhere else." And whenever Helen suggested they meet up outside of Anna's arrangements, Anna would politely decline, always with some excuse or another. It made Helen wonder, just for a moment, if there was something Anna wasn't telling her, but she quickly brushed the thought aside. After all, Anna's life was perfect. She had everything Helen wanted: a loving husband, a beautiful home, and a life of luxury. What could possibly be wrong? One evening, driven by a mix of curiosity and a nagging feeling she couldn't quite shake, Helen decided to visit Anna's house unannounced. She wanted to see for herself the life Anna always talked about, the life she envied so much. As she approached the front door, she noticed it was slightly ajar. Helen hesitated for a moment, then pushed it open. What she saw inside froze her in place, her heart pounding in her chest. Anna was on her knees in the living room, tears streaming down her swollen face. Her hands were trembling as she held a large stone above her head. Greg sat in a chair across from her, a cruel smile on his lips, a cane in his hand. He tapped it against the floor rhythmically, as if he were counting down the seconds until something terrible happened. Helen's mind struggled to process what she was seeing. The perfect life Anna had always described, the husband she had envied. None of it was real. The image of Greg as a loving, doting husband shattered before her eyes, replaced by the cold, harsh reality of the situation. Helen was paralyzed with shock, her thoughts a whirlwind of confusion and disbelief. She stood there, unable to move, unable to speak, as the truth of Anna's life came crashing down around her. And with that, part 1 ends, leaving us hanging in suspense. What will Helen do next? How will this revelation change her perspective on her own life? Will there still be a future for Helen and Paul? And what other secrets might be lurking beneath the surface? The answers await in part 2. I hope you enjoy this story of souls. If so, please like, subscribe, comment, and share with friends and family. And remember, your stories and experiences matters.